Hello and welcome to My Security TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor and Director with My Security Media, and today we're joined by Dr William Stoltz from the Australian National University. He's a Senior Advisor for Public Policy with the National Security College. We have had William on before, so it's great to have him joining us with us again. We're going to be looking at reforming electronic surveillance. This follows on from our interview with Dr Nick Tate from the Australian Computer Society. The ACS also put a submission in, and William and his team at ANU have also put a public submission into the discussion paper from the Department of Home Affairs. So if you've seen the Nick Tate interview, you'll definitely take interest in this one. So let's be joined now by Dr William Stoltz. William, thanks for joining us. Great to have you back. Look, thank you so much for this, and we'll walk through the ANU paper. And I suppose one first question I've got is, where does this sit in terms of the ANU making public submissions and the Australian Security College? Was this a bit of a red flag when you saw it, or you just saw it as an opportunity in terms of, you know, adding to that discussion paper and adding to and contributing?
Yeah, I suppose I saw it really as a great opportunity. I mean, I should say at the outset that this reform initiative that the Department of Home Affairs has kicked off here is quite new. So this isn't a parliamentary inquiry or anything like that. This is born from the recent Richardson review, which looked quite holistically at national security law reform writ large, and it put a central recommendation that Australia's electronic surveillance reform framework really needed a root and branch kind of restructure and review with a new modernised piece of legislation to cover off on electronic surveillance. So the department has initiated this public consultation process, which will go on for quite a while, because this is, to put it honestly, this is probably the most complex piece of legislative reform in the last 40 years in the national security space. So the department put the call out for public submissions, and I suppose I really saw an opportunity here for the ANU to kind of mobilise the resident expertise, not just in the National Security College, but also in our College of Law, to really look at this really important issue, because you know, the National Security College was set up as a joint partnership with the Commonwealth to really improve the study of national security and to provide government with kind of robust, independent policy recommendations. But then, of course, the College of Law at the ANU also has a very deep record and history of informing policy reform in the law enforcement space in particular. So I really thought it was a great opportunity to bring the two communities together. And so this submission that we've put together was informed by a closed-door joint dialogue that we held in December, and got some excellent representation from across the ANU, and we also got some really valuable private briefing from members of the national security community as well to inform the submission. So that's the context to what brought it about. I mean, it's what we hope is the beginning of a kind of quite a long conversation with the department about electronic surveillance reform. You know, the discussion paper they put out was incredibly comprehensive, and I don't think we can necessarily respond to it in just one go. There's lots of thorny issues here, so we hope it's really the beginning of a pretty fulsome dialogue, to be honest.
Yeah, I think they should have called it discussion paper number 1.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of things. One, we'll give Dr Dominique Dalla-Pozza, also a primary author with yourself, and it's really, I think, thank you for providing that background, because you've even got the likes of John Blaxland, Rory Medcalf, and the like mentioned here, Adam Callan. So yeah, I think it's a much deeper submission than what it potentially presents initially. I suppose one question is I had: do you think this is going to be possible? You know, in terms of the vision that the discussion paper sets out, and even when I look at your first key statement of the Commonwealth should take a holistic appreciation of the harm caused to targets by electronic surveillance. And to include the impact of retention and dissemination of surveillance material, as well as the harm caused by the intrusion of surveillance itself. I kind of read that, if I interpret that correctly, you read that this was and I read the discussion paper, it's very comprehensive in terms of where they want to go. They want to do groups, they want to do anyone using a particular app. So I think, and again, as someone, when I spoke to Nick, I've got a policeman's hat on. You know, I've done surveillance and invasive surveillance in the past, and you know, maybe as a police officer, you don't appreciate how invasive that actually is. You've got a job to do. Are you reading that discussion paper as, wow, like there's a lot of power and capability building up here?
Oh yeah, I mean the impact that electronic surveillance electronic surveillance can have in the modern era is pretty powerful. In terms of the complexity of the reform itself, I mean they're trying to consolidate like a vast number or a vast scale of legislation into a single act. You know, the current electronic surveillance framework has kind of been built up in a pretty piecemeal way, really since the 1970s. With a predominant focus on the Telecommunications Act and the Surveillance Devices Act. And so it's become kind of a bit of a Jenga tower, really, where you've had little moments of reform around specific issues kind of just continually bolted on to these legacy laws. And so at the heart of this reform is this idea or this aspiration of trying to create a technology agnostic piece of legislation that it can be enduring despite technology changes and advances in forms of surveillance. I think in principle, that's a great thing to aspire to. But I think, as we know just from our own anecdotal experiences, technology change has been so rapid in recent times and has enabled forms of surveillance that law enforcement agencies wouldn't necessarily have anticipated, but have nevertheless taken advantage of. And so I'm perhaps a little bit skeptical about the ability to create a kind of enduring piece of legislation that doesn't have to be reformed as frequently as perhaps the department's envisaging. But certainly electronic surveillance as an activity does go to really fundamental questions about how we balance individual freedoms, that we balance freedom and privacy against, justice and law enforcement and security. So in that sense, this was also an opportunity to really get to the heart of some kind of first principles about how we as a liberal democratic society want to deal with having government agencies having these types of intrusive powers.
I think one aspect is, and I just don't see it happening, is the state and Commonwealth legislation aligning in this. And I think there's the other one is, I read the discussion paper is really looking at national security and national security threats, including the ASIO Act. And I'm wondering whether that should be separated from, say, a state police agency or a regulatory agency that might want to do interception or benefit from intercepted material versus an ASIO that potentially could have unlimited power and coercive powers and allow that, but you don't want sort of state police having access to those types of powers or that type of material as well. Do you see there's going to be a need for segregation, and did it discuss that enough?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, in some instances, state police forces actually have more intrusive powers than Commonwealth agencies, not specifically in the case of electronic surveillance, but in some aspects. But you're quite right that the ability to kind of reconcile those disparate jurisdictions, we see that across various policy areas, that's a constant problem. That's the nature of existing in a federation, I suppose. To your point, though, about the balancing of law enforcement and national security objectives, it's something that we did point to in our discussion paper, that at the moment in Commonwealth legislation, there's kind of this very nebulous concept of serious crime that is used to kind of bridge criminal activity and I guess what you would call national security issues. And that's often been what's been used in legislation to designate certain crimes as being, well, that's a serious crime and that can attract the application of what we would call national security powers. But I suppose the difficulty with that is that it's also kind of capturing a lot of offences that we wouldn't necessarily traditionally think of as security issues. So, for example, child exploitation activities and certain organised crime activities that people wouldn't immediately think of as national security issues. But what it also does is it also sometimes misses offences that might be lower down the spectrum, but still related to a national security threat. So you think about the kind of preparatory activities that someone who might be preparing for a terrorist attack might engage in, there's going to be perhaps quite like low level offences as part of their build up to a terrorist attack that you wouldn't necessarily say is captured by serious crime, but we'd nevertheless want agencies to be able to deploy, the relevant surveillance powers to be able to observe that offence and then interdict it. So I think that there is a tension here, that this blurring of the lines between law enforcement and national security, and that also goes to the kind of the heart of what agencies' purposes are as well. Many decades ago, like, we set up ASIO as a separate, specifically oversighted organisation with these national security powers, separate from organisations like state law enforcement and the AFP. Now we're kind of blurring them back together, and I don't know if that's necessarily the most coherent approach for the Australian public, because transparency is also about making sure that ordinary Australians can actually understand the powers that are being used and the justification for them. But you look at the legislation and potentially look at the legislation that's being created here, and that's perhaps not always apparent.
One area I wanted to cover, well, there was a couple, but you talked about serious crime and the like, and I get that, but it's picking up the Surveillance Devices Act and video conferencing, and then also I think just street CCTV as well, and that's where it brings it down, sort of the separation between national security and law enforcement. And in the discussions with Nick and the ACS and we still see it often, police accessing video surveillance without any warrant, because it's just sort of put up and allowed voluntarily, provided to the police, and even police going to ISPs and the like, and getting information without a warrant. But I think there's like 35 different warrant types, 1,000 pieces of legislation, so you can't necessarily expect the police to be across all that legislation. Do you think it's possible to provide that, or the trigger? I see that you've got here a public interest advocate potentially in here as well. What was your observations on the Surveillance Devices Act and the use around that, and the use of video in particular? And we'll come back to the PIA.
Yeah, I suppose you're quite right. There's a wide range of ways in which the police can access, not just police, but other agencies as well, can access surveillance information without a warrant. And open source, the growth of open source intelligence as well, is also really allowing for a lot of surveillance type activities that aren't warranted. And that's why we really emphasised up front with our discussion paper that the Commonwealth legislation needs to treat surveillance in a really holistic way, that when we consider the harm that's caused by surveilling someone, that it's not just in the act of observing them in that moment of time. So whether it is through CCTV footage or something like that, that you're actually appreciating that there is an ongoing intrusion that happens to the target through the retention and the dissemination of surveillance material. And something that we draw attention to that I personally don't think was as well addressed in the discussion paper as it should be, is also the use of predictive data. We see law enforcement intelligence agencies acquiring ever more kind of sophisticated artificial intelligence systems. And if you're able to anticipate somebody's behavior in the real world, their pattern of life, to my mind, that is no less intrusive than watching a recording of what they did yesterday, or watching them in a live stream. So I think we need to appreciate the full life cycle of what's happening to the data and the information that we capture on someone, and that to my mind means that we do need to treat open source acquired information perhaps a little bit more rigorously than it has been, because even though that single data point, at the moment you acquire it, you might say, well, that's not that intrusive because it's just, it's fairly innocuous footage or information. It's when it's put in aggregate with everything else that it's can potentially be quite intrusive. And at the moment, our system doesn't really think about surveillance in that way. It really just focuses it at that single point of surveillance or intrusion. So that's really something we were really encouraging the department to kind of put quite front and center in the way they consider this legislation.
It does mention AI, quantum computing, and sort of that sort of future technology, but does it discuss predictive analytics on intercepted data at all? And you would think that that would have been on their mind at some point. And then how would you, how are you going to legislate something that's predictive? Because you're absolutely right. Two or three pieces of information start to create a picture, and then something that, again, with the ACS interview is when they sort of access an application or they start to access or target a group, that collective data creates data lakes that they're never going to throw away. That's the other, and I think that's another key point here is data storage. All of this information will be retained. I think you're right when you raise retention and dissemination of that data. It's the agencies will have the capability to store practically everything, and what they legally intercept under a warrant can be used potentially in another case that might be unrelated as well. So it is quite a, if you think 10 years down the track, what this could actually mean. I think that maybe then comes to the public interest advocate. How do you see that potentially working?
Yeah, look, it's something that we as a discussion group actually had quite a wide range of thoughts on. You know, there's been the concept of the PIA, as it's kind of been thus far argued for, is that it would be kind of a external or an agency or an individual separate from the law enforcement and intelligence agencies, kind of almost acting as an additional layer of oversight alongside existing bodies like the Inspector General for Intelligence and Security or the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity. There was concern in the discussion group we had that there was actually a risk associated with that if you created a single public interest advocate that was separate from the collectors, that you might actually create a permission structure for individual investigators to kind of delegate or forego their own ethical obligations for the public interest, because they could say, well, I don't need to worry about that because there's a public interest advocate separately to this process that will take a look at it. So all I need to care about is, operational imperatives, that sort of thing, which is obviously when we think about, philosophically, what is important to anyone being a public servant is that every public servant kind of has a universal obligation to exercise the special powers and responsibilities they get as a public servant, that they do that with due regard for the impact on civil liberties and the public interest. So we actually kind of suggested that on the one hand, yes, it could be useful to have a separate body, but what's probably also really important is that agencies be properly resourced to have internal advocates as well, people that are there to actually help, educate and make sure that there's a culture, a positive culture within the agencies that respects the public interest, respect for civil liberties, these sorts of things. Because ultimately, that idea of making sure that agencies are using these powers not only in a legal way but in an ethical way, that is actually cultural. And I think we need to manage our expectations about how much we can actually prescribe that in legislation. You can't prescribe in legislation an agency having a healthy culture when it comes to these sorts of things. You need it to be built within the organization itself. So we were kind of suggesting that maybe it needs to be a dual model where you have a big, powerful PIA kind of separate from the agencies, but that there's also internal advocates as well who really help engender that positive culture.
I think the only pushback on that one in terms of culture, I think you're absolutely right of the culture, but I think the culture in agencies is to either get the job done or the easiest way to achieve their mission. So I think I probably would say that the culture is not there for the public interest, and we did see that with the COVID-related data. I think it happened in WA as well. The moment sort of the check-in codes and the QR codes and all of that data becomes available, and the police see it, homicide investigation, I believe, and another serious crime, they'll go and access it. So they're not really too concerned. I don't think they do see a wider picture here, or the strategic picture of the impacts of this, because again, and I go back to my own experience, doing a homicide, you are a vacuum. You will vacuum up everything because you don't know, and even down into taking people's DNA and collecting all of that. Think about the size of the macro investigation. and the powers there. And then again, they don't have to throw that stuff out if it's given voluntarily. So I just think the PIA is probably a good one, but I'd actually take it outside of an agency and have it as a completely independent. And I think if you have it internally, you're going to get pushback too, like you'll have internal conflict. So it's a really hard one, because one, I'm always in two minds of, you've got to give the police as much opportunity as possible to achieve their mission, whatever that may be. But then again, from a public's perspective, you don't want it going into the wrong hands, because you know, it would be as bad as an authoritarian nation, you know, when you think about some of the powers that we have. I suppose in that mind of the changes in the transparency and the public understanding, how broad this discussion should be. Like, we've done a couple of interviews on it, but this has been out for a little while. I haven't seen any public discussion on this. Where do you think it should go in terms of the broader public sort of persona and what we're talking about?
Yeah, look, to the department's credit, they have begun to engage in more public events, and I understand that they plan to do more throughout this process. So the Australian Strategic Policy Institute did host a public event where Secretary Pizzullo and the Secretary of the Attorney General's Department did a public event to discuss this initiative. You know, that's really great to see. Obviously, there's only ever going to be so many people in the Australian community who are really paying attention to these things, people like yourself, which is excellent. Look, I think that there's a larger transparency piece for law enforcement and intelligence agencies writ large in Australia. You know, we've seen Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, undertake his annual threat assessments. He did the third one this year, which obviously generated a little bit of public attention and activity in Parliament. But those types of exercises in public transparency are actually really vital to public trust and understanding at a time of pretty thorny kind of geopolitical strife and national security change in Australia. And I'd love to see that from other agency heads as well, just really kind of getting out there as much as they can. And there's multiple different ways to do it. You know, you can do it in those formal settings, but I think it's also just through things like, you know, we saw ASIO a couple of years ago commission an official history. These types of products are really important to just making sure that Australians actually have a realistic appreciation of what these agencies are doing in their name. Because at the moment, as we know, it's in the information environment that we live in, it's very easy for misunderstanding, misinformation, and kind of conspiracy theories to spread around what these agencies do. And I think more often than not, people actually have an overinflated sense of what agencies' powers and capabilities are.
Well, look, can I just stop you on that one? Capabilities, and I was going to raise it earlier. You mentioned resources and how something like this is resourced. So from the ACS submission, they're saying stop deputizing technology companies, because basically police are going with a warrant saying whatever technology you've got or we want access to, and you're not allowed to tell anybody. You know, they can go into a company and, you know, get them to start to work for them. The resourcing of this, and I don't see too much on your submission in terms of resources. Did you look at technical skills and resources from the agency's viewpoint as well? Because there is your single electronic surveillance agency as means to manage authorizations and disseminations is unlikely to be effective or feasible, and that's probably the only opportunity that they would have to get specific technical skills that they might need. Yeah.
So in our submission, this particular submission was really focused at kind of the first core principles about what the legislation should look like. So we haven't dived into the capability requirements that much, but it's certainly a big issue, you know, because it's a very quite niche select workforce that is able to do this type of activity, and you also want it done really well. So when you're talking about potentially expanding access to electronic surveillance powers to additional agencies, it should be tempered with an understanding of, well, actually, if we do give that agency this power, will they have the skill set and the professionalization in the agency to actually use those powers properly? That does have to be a consideration. And certainly, you know, the reality is that it's just going to be more efficient for agencies to partner with the private sector on some of these things rather than build a capability internally. And I think, that obviously does create challenges for the telecommunications industry in particular, about how they manage their own relationships with the public. And I think there's a transparency piece for big tech firms as well to also be more open with the public about how much information companies not only are obligated to hand over through legislation, but how much they voluntarily hand over. Because that's something that's often not discussed as much, which is that most telecommunications companies actually undertake voluntary assistance with law enforcement and intelligence agencies rather than wait to be, commanded to do so under legislation. So I think there's a transparency piece there as well. But and in terms of the capability and the funding that's required, as the technology changes, we're going to require a larger workforce and ever more kind of sophisticated technical capabilities in order to undertake electronic surveillance. And I think just from an efficiency point of view, there's going to always be a temptation for government to just lean heavily on industry to repurpose systems that they've already established.
Yeah, I think there will be pushback because I think there's always going to be a line here. I mentioned that to Nick, is whether there will be a defined line. Law enforcement might just have to go, yeah, we can't go that far. We don't have the resources. Industry doesn't have the time.
Yeah.
The technology is too advanced. You think about Web 3.0 and sort of a metaverse. That's coming within 3 to 5 years, and so that's all new crime types as well. So, good luck. They're always going to be a sort of a 5-year sort of phase for them to catch up. They're never going to be current, and something that, and I think you've raised it too, that despite the best efforts, it's unlikely that a truly technology agnostic, completely future-proofed electronic surveillance framework can be realised. The ACS have also kind of raised that in their submission, that discussions around AI and quantum and intercepting that is way too early. So fair enough for them to raise it now, but I think the realisation will have to be made, right?
Yeah, I agree, and that's why one of the things that we've actually advocated for is that they actually build into this new electronic surveillance legislation a kind of every 10 or 15 years a trigger point for another holistic review like this one that's being undertaken, so that this kind of piecemeal, fairly reactionary approach to legislative reform that's happened over the last couple of years is somewhat kind of pulled back a bit. Like, there's always going to be urgent operational requirements where something changes you didn't expect and you need to legislate, next week. But there are a lot of other reforms that probably could wait every decade or so for that refresh. And part of that as well is we've also said that it's also really important that you have something like a national security statement to Parliament or something like that, where the responsible minister actually gets up and explains to Parliament and therefore the public about the threat environment, the operating environment that warrants these extraordinary powers, and kind of brings a little bit of coherence to why these powers exist and potentially why they might need to be reformed out of cycle and that sort of thing. Because at the moment, in recent years, we've seen some pretty rapid legislative reform it's difficult for people like myself or even people in the media who are trying to pay attention to it to even really understand why it's happening. There was a very quick reform to the ASIO Act last year that was kind of rushed through in a couple of days, and that really hinders transparency and our ability to actually understand why these things are changing. And obviously, there's always operational sensitivities that things can't be discussed as explicitly that publicly, but I think you need to try your best to have a kind of sanitized, declassified conversation with the public and with the Parliament. Because otherwise that's how you kind of get these weird conspiracy theories pop up about what's happening.
Yeah, look, I second that. If you struggle keeping up, then makes me feel better, because I can't keep up with all of this. And interestingly, you mentioned that is, I think last time we had you on was a discussion paper that you wrote on Australia's need for an intelligence minister, and potentially that kind of backs up exactly what we're talking about here is that central point. I also like it when Mike Burgess and the like come out with a public statement, put themselves out in the public record. And I think it's good. Again, I think for a liberal democracy, you don't want them hiding in the background like they used to. And that does create debate. Just controlling the politicians afterwards is the challenge, but
Yeah.
I think the public sees through a lot of that as well. And look, subject to time as well. Taiwan, I'm doing a review and it doesn't work on my green screen for whatever reason. Australian Foreign Affairs, latest edition, the Taiwan Choice Showdown in Asia. You've got a paper in here on preventing malware and sort of more of Australia's legislative framework for malware and ransomware attacks and the like, and then how Australia could take a potential lead on this. And in fact, even just today, the agencies have come out with a Russian attributed malware. A new version of that is out following the Ukraine-Russia conflict at the moment. So this legislation potentially is needed. And we've also got the new Critical Infrastructure Protection Act and a range of things. The latest, sort of the second round of the bill for critical infrastructure protection, where attacks on critical infrastructure, cyber attacks will incur a large jail term, I think 25 years or 20 years. Is that kind of what you had in mind when you read this, or do you think there's still some room to go?
Look, what I was arguing for in the foreign affairs piece is just for what I think is some kind of practical, rational legislative reform around possession of malware, because at the moment, all the offence framework relates to the harm or the damage done by using malware in a destructive way.
Well, you've got to use it first, right? So, yeah, your argument says, hang on, if you've got it, potentially with an intent, that's far enough.
And I understand, people have said to me there's a lot of kind of technical issues around, establishing, I suppose, whether someone actually knew that there was malware on their computer, all those sorts of things. And then an investigator would obviously have to go through that. Yeah. But it's just the current framework places investigators in Australia in a kind of awkward position where they can actually identify when someone has a fairly serious cyber weapon on their computer, but they can't actually act to interdict that until a whole lot of other trigger points are met around the intent and potentially even post-fact after it's actually been used. So it's not I'm not saying that criminalizing the possession of malware is going to solve the problem entirely. It's not. This is going to be, you're going to have to come at this problem for a lot of different angles. But I was arguing that here's a piece of fairly rational legislative reform that we could undertake, but also springboard off it to advocate for similar reform at an international law level. So the United Nations is currently going through the process, or beginning what it will be a lengthy process of actually creating a cybersecurity treaty around kind of these issues and other issues relating to cyber-enabled crime. The treaty itself has been advocated for actually by China and Russia, but they did actually end up getting the support of the General Assembly to bring this treaty into development. So Western countries like Australia really didn't want this to happen at first, because we saw this as a ploy by the Chinese and the Russians to kind of enshrine in international law their norms around intervening in people's lives online. But I think, nevertheless, there is an opportunity, because this treaty is being brought into development, for Australia and other Western countries to say, all right, well, we now think it is a good idea we have a cyber security treaty, and potentially we could include some things like greater restrictions around the possession of malware as well. And that kind of does force the Russians and the Chinese to a certain point to either follow the international community in recognizing that greater restrictions of malware is required, or to kind of, I guess, tacitly acknowledge that they would prefer to kind of be a bit of a pariah on this issue. Because, we saw early last year with the Microsoft Exchange attack that happened, the use of the Chinese in actually, I guess, using contract criminals to undertake the malware attacks. And then also the Russians as well, in some of their activities, have also leveraged private hackers. And as a result, they've also, in doing that, they've kind of let a lot of this malware out there into the wild. Which is incredibly irresponsible. Now it's out there, it's being repurposed by other cyber criminals. And we need to pressure, we being, Western liberal democratic countries, we need to pressure Russia and China on that activity, because it's an incredibly irresponsible thing that they're doing. And so, look, international law, people are pretty skeptical about its ability these days to actually solve problems, but I think there are potentially some constructive avenues for us to get to, a better digital environment. A thing I'm always banging on is that we as a society are still in the kind of fairly early stages of figuring out how to be digitally, as integrated as we are. How do we run a cohesive, healthy society and be as plugged online as we are? That's a really, both with the electronic surveillance reform initiative and with international law initiatives, it's a really big trouble. It's a really big problem for lawmakers to understand how they regulate in this space to create a healthier, more cohesive digital society. So, it's a fascinating time, and to my mind, it needs kind of innovative, creative solutions, and we do need to be willing to experiment a bit, and that's where things like the electronic surveillance reform comes into it, and it is a really good thing to see, where it's an opportunity to potentially take a really greenfields approach to how we legislate around these issues. So I'm really eager to keep the ANU and my colleagues engaged in it to make sure that we can, hopefully have the as future-proofed legislative regime as we can get.
Yeah, look, I think you've nailed it there. We're looking at sort of the protection of the public, not just from the technology itself, as well as from adversaries in a new digital environment. And our digital economy will rely on it too. So, William, please, and thank you also to the ANU. You keep coming on and talking to us and producing good work as well, that again creates that insight. I think from all stakeholders need to be reading these documents as well. So thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, no, thank you, Chris. It's really kind of you to have me on. I really appreciate it.
Great. So Dr. William A. Stoltz, Senior Advisor for Public Policy, National Security College with the Australian National University. Enjoy the rest of your day, William. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See ya.